Good afternoon, everybody. May I have your attention? Hopefully, you're all enjoying the lovely lunch that's sitting in front of you and that you're having a good conference so far. It's a nice and sunny, beautiful day, not as hot, so welcome. I am Seema Kumar. I am Vice President for Innovation Communications at Johnson & Johnson, and it's a pleasure to host this special luncheon here at the World Congress of Science Journalists. And I think we have really a phenomenal crowd here to talk about a topic that is of great importance, but also something that is a passion of mine and is a passion of many of the folks here sitting here on this panel. And that has to do with how do we engage people in championing science for the betterment of society, of everyone, everywhere. So I think it's safe to say that we're here sitting in a room where we're preaching to the choir, probably. Most of us here don't need convincing that science is an important enterprise and it plays a crucial role in creating a better society. But many people don't recognize the impact that science makes on a daily basis, and the engagement that people have in science seems to be going down. So we look at trust barometers, we look at a variety of different criteria, and just anecdotally, it seems like the interest in science, the trust in science seems to be sort of waning. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Is that real, or is that something that is that's something that we're imagining? And most people also don't realize the connection between a basic discovery or science or clinic that happens in the lab or the clinic and how it impacts their daily lives. And what value scientists themselves bring to the quality, improving quality of life and health of people all around the world. The public, of course, sometimes has a love-hate relationship with science. On the one hand, there is awe and wonderment, especially, Mary, about the research, for example, in space exploration and in marine biology and disciplines like that, whereas in other places, then there is, a lot of skepticism or difficulty in understanding the relevance. So, today, what we are going to do is to look at some of these issues, discuss them here. And here we have an illustrious and very engaged panel with us. And I'm happy to be joined by, first of all, on the extreme left is Natasha Loder. Natasha is the health policy editor for The Economist, a journalist and editor in print, radio, and film. She has previously worked as Economist's health correspondent, the Midwest correspondent, and a science and technology correspondent. She's covered a large variety of subjects from science, medicine, space, technology, the environment, policy, and politics. And before 2000, she worked as a news reporter for the journal Nature. And then immediately to my left is Dr. Flavia Schlegel. And Flavia is the inaugural special envoy for science and global policy at the International Science Council, which is a new NGO. Is it an old NGO or a new NGO? New NGO that brings together 40 international scientific unions and associations and over 140 national and regional scientific organizations, including academies and research councils. Wow, that sounds like a pretty impressive group of people. And then we also have here with us Thierry Zoumahoun. Thierry, thank you for joining us. He's the executive director and head of secretariat of the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, Next Einstein Initiative, and founder and chair of the Next Einstein Forum. It's a global development expert in educational and scientific programs, administration, and non-for-profit business startups, and micro-enterprise development in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And we have Mary Woolley, who is the president of Research America, the United States' largest non-for-profit membership-supported grassroots public relations, or public education, I should say, an advocacy organization committed to making medical and health research a higher priority for the United States. So we have somebody from the UK, Natasha, somebody from the United States, Mary, somebody from Africa, Thierry, and somebody from right here in Switzerland, Flavia. So we've got a diverse group of people here to talk about science and science journalism. Welcome. So let's dive in. First of all, Natasha, I'm going to start with you. And we know, I mean, we are here at the World Conference of Science Journalists, and you are a science journalist, right? So all of us sort of do some way, shape, or form communications of science. But science journalists play a really important role in bridging the gap between scientists and the public and institutions that conduct science and the public. You focus a lot on accuracy in telling facts, in telling the story as it is. But what role do you think science journalists play in advocating for the larger enterprise of science?
Wow, that's a really tough question. I think as human beings, we obviously play a role in society, and that's why I'm here, is that I feel it's important to advocate science. You know, ultimately, I'm there for my readers, and they believe in reason, they believe in science, and so to that extent, I do believe I have to sort of serve my readers. So there is a sort of a dual role there. I mean, I can't sort of pull apart who I am from my job, and I'm a sort of moral and ethical person. So that's the context in which I operate.
So, you know, when you think about that, when you think about your audience, who do you think of? Is it just, I mean, because we constantly talk about the public, but there's different segments of the public, right?
So I write for a specialist magazine of quite educated readers, and I have the luxury of knowing that my readers, like, they're educated, they're willing to work hard with new ideas. I don't have to explain very basic concepts to them. So, you know, and they're eager. They're eager to sort of, you know, consume the information that I'm offering, as long as it's delivered in a sort of an entertaining and engaging fashion. So I do feel I have quite a good audience to work with. That's not necessarily true of every member of the public, and so, you know, I'm only ever reaching a slice of the public, and I think you have to kind of realize that. And so when you are, you know, when you're talking about engaging the broader public, you're going to have to do that in many different ways. You can't just necessarily rely on one journalist or even a group of journalists.
Mary, who is your audience, would you say? And, you know, to some degree, you also are day in and day out engaged in communicating science and its value to society. And that's an important piece of the advocacy work that Research America does. So what is your audience and how do you do it?
Sure. Let me first say, though, Seema, how nice it is to join you all up here. And listening to Natasha reminds me that what we say at Research America to the science community that we work with so closely is that scientists have something in common with journalists that they don't always appreciate or articulate, and that's serving the public's interest. You know, the public of your publication, maybe not necessarily the full public, but certainly for the science community, being more in touch with those of us who fund us, who set policies and regulations that guide science, and those would be elected officials, elected and appointed officials, and those whom we serve, the public, all become audiences for Research America. And we work with those audiences to raise the profile of science, to make it a more relevant and a more well-supported part of the experience of living in America, or for that matter, anywhere in the world. But people have gotten disconnected from science over time. Things that we used to take, that used to be thought about and studied and hungered for, like, could we please eradicate measles? Could we have a vaccine for the measles? And now that that's possible and has been in place for many decades in the US, people have forgotten and now are complacent about it, and worse, doubt that it really does have impact or that it can even do harm. So there's a lot of issues and concerns that we have to deal with all the time. But I firmly believe, and we do at Research America, that the answer long term is more engagement by the science community with the public, including the journalists who are one of the ways that the public receives information and has an opportunity to think it through.
Thank you. Thank you, Mary. Thierry, so you are a champion of science and the scientific enterprise. Your focus is on Africa. But my question to you, as with the next Einstein Forum, and as you communicate the important science that is taking place in Africa and the rise of entrepreneurship and the young millennials and the broad group of scientists who are doing research and science in Africa, who is your audience? Is it Africa itself, the continent of Africa, or is it outside of Africa, or both? And what is your message?
Actually, I would say it's both. And when you go into both, there are three groups of audiences. Number one is the young people. You know, Africa is a young continent. Number two, policymakers. Number three, people in academia and research institutions. And the reason why I'm saying this, I will take a step back and tell you that when people look at Africa, they see Africa as the cradle of we all know that Africa is the cradle of humanity. But what we forget is that Africa is not only the cradle of humanity, Africa is not just an exporter of sports people and singers, but Africa is the cradle of mathematical sciences. Africa invented mathematical sciences, not Greece. Greece never invented mathematics. I can give you plenty of
Anybody
examples.
from Greece here?
Exactly. No offense. So that's something we like to, at the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences and the next Einstein Forum, we like to remind everyone that Africa got slipped out of the arc of innovation from the discovery of how to tally numbers through to modern technology today. So when we communicate about science, what we're saying is to say, hey, to the international, to the global community, yes, when you look at Africa, there are many challenges. There are there's poverty and sufferings here and there, diseases, but do not forget that all the regions on the planet will have to count with Africa going forward. This is a specific century that no continent, no other region can afford to ignore Africa, number one. So we want to sensitize people to get back on track when it comes to perspective and paradigm and narrative about Africa. The second thing we aim at communicating, a friend of ours one former ambassador of Canada to Pretoria, he visited one of our center of excellence in Muizenberg, in Cape Town. And he said, and rightly so, when it comes to Africa, what AIMS is doing and the Next Einstein Forum is doing is amazing, because it rarely happens that you see the words Africa and science in the same sentence. You can see Africa in singers, drummers, and then sports people. That's okay. So to the point where today it's easy when you ask millennials and then young people in Africa, they know almost all the great singers, not only in Africa, but around the globe. Go to Asia, they will name them. They will name all the great sports people. They can't name one single African scientist. We want to change that perspective in communicating science. We want to change that narrative. And the third reason, the third audience, the reason why we communicate science is to get our policymakers to do more when it comes to science, for a simple reason. The United States and Europe can afford to do ivory tower science. Africa cannot afford that. Any scientist living in Africa or any scientist living outside of Africa, working on Africa, science in Africa, must not forget that there's one reason why people will listen to him or her is to work on issues that affect Africa's transformation. When you're doing that, you may be sitting in an ivory tower, but you must be able to communicate to the public what you're doing. The last category of people are industry leaders. Africa has a young, booming startups. They need to draw on science and research outputs to really move the continent forward. Those are the reasons and the audiences we want to reach.
Thank you, Thierry. Flavia, who is your audience? And, I mean, when you have a group of, European research academies and universities, how do you sort of differentiate who you're communicating with, and what is the message, and what is the mission there?
Well, I think the International Science Council is a membership organization. So we have academies, which are national academies, but we also have international organizations like the International Union of Applied Physics or Chemistry or Astronomy, because we're sort of like close to celebrating the moon landing. So I think the point you're making is that the communication also for the International Science Council has to be target group specific. And our main clients obviously are our members, so these are scientists, because the members of the member organizations are all scientists in one way or another. And the International Science Council is promoting the interests of scientists, so it's very much about the freedom and the independence of science, but also scientists. It's very much about responsibility and transparency, and it's very much about creating an ecosystem where science can thrive. And what actually excites me here to be now at this World Conference of Science Journalists, that I think we need both media and science, a similar ecosystem to have free media and also free science. And it was interesting that yesterday the Vice President of Switzerland, Simonetta Sommaruga, and Frédéric Vidal, the Minister of Education of France, they were both talking about free media and free science sort of like as the fundamentals for a democratic development and also sustainable development of the country. So coming back to your point is, the main target groups, the main clients of what we do are, on one hand, are the scientists. And on the other hand, it's the policymakers, because it is about policymakers creating that ecosystem, looking at funding schemes, at investing in science when it's the public, when it's obviously public funding. And a third target audience is the private sector, because we also have to relate to the fact that worldwide about 2/3 of research funding is within the private sector, and only about 1/3 is coming from the public sector. So, and obviously there are some vested interests when it comes to the private sector. And I do obviously also sign into that scientists have to communicate. But I would also argue that scientists need some support and some help, because you might be actually a great scientist, but you might be a very bad communicator. So who takes up that communication? And I think this is why, Seema, I do also congratulate you and your team and Johnson & Johnson, because I think you're trying to create here a network of champions for science, not necessarily just scientists, because again, they have to be good in their lab, but also to create here this network of science brokers, of science facilitators, and particularly with all of you, or the ones in the audience who are science journalists, to somewhat translate what's happening in that lab or out there, which doesn't mean that the scientist, and I think it was Natasha you were talking, you are also a citizen, and we're also all global citizens, that I think that the scientist has a responsibility to make sure that it is relevant what he or she is doing in that lab. But I think in that communication, many scientists also need some support, because that's not their core business.
Yeah, there's a lot there, Flavia. Thank you. Because there's three things. One, whose responsibility? Is it to communicate? Is it the scientist? Or do we need to create a bunch of additional sort of reinforcement, so to speak, of champions of science, number one. And then we'll get into that as to some scientists who are good at communicating, get somewhat sort of looked down upon by their peers because then their science is no longer pure because they're doing too much communicating. The other part of it also has to do with the notion that we feel like science should be championed. And so I'm going to ask all of us this one question. We've assumed, right, a presumption underlying some of the questions and even this panel discussion is that science is an important enterprise, and we need to make sure that this enterprise is appreciated and supported and championed. Is that really the case? Why should it be?
The Enlightenment.
Yeah.
That's my answer. The Enlightenment happened.
Yes.
Reason and knowledge and facts are what means we have human progress. I believe that, and I hope, well, everyone here is going to agree with that. We're at the World Conference of Science.
Yeah, that's what I said. We're preaching to the choir.
I think even if you were to go out on the street, and not even just in Geneva, let's just take, I don't know, East End of London, and you were to ask someone, is science a good idea? I think you would get more a good thing. People would say probably more likely to say yes than no, and that they would think of, maybe space exploration, maybe health and medicine, that sort of thing. And so, I don't have a problem with the premise, and I think that generally I think humans are making I'm an optimist. I'm a huge optimist. I think there's some really dangerous trends in society. I think social media has sort of weaponized information in a way that makes it difficult to have what I would call a rational debate sometimes online about things. But I don't think, the whole enterprise, the whole human progress enterprise is threatened. That's not what I think.
Yeah. Mary, why is it important, number one? But I'm also going to ask you to answer that, but also talk a little bit about, do you really think, have you done any studies to show whether trust in science or the scientific enterprise or the engagement has gone down?
So I completely agree with Natasha that it's important for sort of self-evident reasons, but especially in these days when people do feel less connected to science, if you will, and even though their aspirations for better fill in the blank, better life, better products, better health, have not gone away. People do aspire to better. So there's lots of reasons, I think, for the science community to treat it as a serious obligation to engage with the public and not leave that to others. And you asked about that. I think that it should be part of the education, especially at the graduate level, although undergraduate fine too, the education of scientists to learn, in addition to becoming more and more proficient about their science, to become proficient in learning about the public context of the science that is going to be their career. It exists in a world of achieving public expectations, achieving expectations of one's employer, whomever that may be, of being able to communicate effectively. And these are things that can be taught. And if they became a part of the culture of science, we wouldn't be having conversations about should we leave it to a few people who are better than others. Some will always be better than others, but it won't be a scorned activity. When it comes to trust, which is one of the reasons, not the only one, but one of the reasons why I think that scientists should be doing more to engage with the public, trust is based on relationships. It's based on connecting to people. It's based on listening, not lecturing. It's built on winning hearts as well as minds. It's built on storytelling, and the list goes on. So we do, as part of our work, we commission public opinion surveys regularly and also track those that others commission. And we know that trust in institutions institutions in the, and I'm going to speak about the United States here, trust in institutions has been going down steadily over decades now. So that trust in the Congress, for example, is an all-time low. It's like 2 digits, number 2, not 2 digits. Hasn't gotten to 10 for a long time. Trust in universities, trust in university education has gone below 50% for the first time in history in the US. It's very concerning. However, when you ask a similar question about trust in individuals, individuals in the military, individuals in science, individuals in the delivery of healthcare and so forth, these are much higher percentages and have not gone down substantially, so that the individuals are the secret to maintaining trust for the institution. The problems come in when the individuals either are well known and turn out to be very bad actors, and I give you the Congress without naming names, or when the individuals are increasingly invisible themselves. And Terry, just to make you feel a little better about people not knowing the names of African scientists, in the US, only 1 in 5 Americans can name a living scientist. Only 1 in 5. So 80% can't. They don't even guess.
Yeah, and that's because we don't make scientists visible as
That's right.
Celebrities, not in the bad way, but in a good way.
That's right. Yeah. Not as celebrities, or not even as individuals sitting on the sidelines of the soccer game, chatting with the fellow parent or grandparent of the kids on the field, and someone asks that scientist, so what do you do? So they don't often identify themselves as scientists per se. They might identify with a university or with a company, but they don't choose willingly to get into a conversation about science. So they do become more and more invisible, and that hasn't changed for 30 years, that approximate percentage. Even worse is if we ask people, can you give me the name of a place where medical or health research is conducted? This is a pretty simple question. Any place where it's conducted. 2/3 of the American public cannot. It's also invisible to them where that science is being conducted. It's a little bit higher if you just say, can you give me the name of a place science is conducted? A lot of people will say NASA. So that does raise the question, but that's the only outlier, the only highly recognized place where the public associates with conduct of science.
That's very, very, very interesting, and what it goes to show is that perhaps we haven't done a good enough job of celebrating and championing science and showcasing it in such a way that it is just as scientists are just as recognizable as sports stars or musicians or other, or in the case of Africa, the drummers and the singers. Thierry, question for you, and the question is, why is science so important in the African context? Why is it important that Africa has been, quote unquote, until recently, ostensibly left behind in the broader conversation, international conversation about science? And what can be done about it?
I think it's important for many practical reasons. You might be surprised to hear some of our leaders and scientists, when I interact with the young African scientists across universities and our own network of centers of excellence, why are you doing science? What's your research on? Almost all of them are doing science to change lives, to improve lives in their own communities, which is totally different from the kind of science education I've been through, where our elders
ancestors
went through.
and
Exactly.
forefathers, yeah.
So which is just, you do it for intellectual curiosity, and at the end of the day, if you're in academia, you publish nice papers, you gain some ranking in the journals, become professors. Today, young African scientists do want to be excellent academics and research scientists, but they want to solve problems. When you see all the problems, challenges Africa is facing, that's one reason. Why is this science is important for Africa? It's because of the many challenges that Africa is facing or the world is facing. If Africa, being a young continent with young people, gifted and talented people, bright people, with them engaging with science endeavors, they will help solve not only the challenges of Africa, but the challenges that humanity faces, climate science. Now, why is it so important for us not just to leave the communication of science in the hands of science journalists? Scientists need to get involved because, sometimes they shy away from communicating their own science because they don't want to be perceived by their own peers as diluting science, engaging into PR. But at some point, they will have no choice, especially in this current global context, where some of our world leaders are casting doubts on science, confusing the younger generation, and they're super powerful people. I think scientists need to speak up. They need to speak out to present whatever they're working on, their research output. And lastly, in the context of Africa, African leaders have been talking about Africa's transformation. We really need it. And we can, I don't like the terminology of leapfrogging, jumping ahead, copy paste the development in the West in the terms of Rostow's model. But science is important if what our leaders are saying in Africa, if it's not void speeches, then you need more investment in science. But for you to get more investment in science, policymakers will need to understand, need your science to be communicated in the language that they understand. If they don't understand that language, it's not going to take off. At the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences and Next Science Forum, we've tried to do something.
Yes.
We launched a couple of years ago the Scientific African. We didn't want to reinvent the wheel. You have the Scientific American. So we launched a journal, which is a top peer-review open access journal. And we have published the 4th edition recently. But then we realized that many more people have been are getting more and more interested in reading that journal. But not everybody is scientist. And even if you're a scientist, an agronomist is not necessarily, may not necessarily understand physics. So we decided a year ago in December, last December, to launch the African Scientific Magazine. The same articles that young African scientists publish in that peer-reviewed journal, we make it accessible in the magazine so that anybody, anyone lambda, could read it and understand it. I can tell you, the excitement is generated among policymakers and the general public is enormous. People actually will try to read the African Scientific Magazine before they go back to the article, even if they can only understand 10% of what the articles is talking about.
But see, that goes back to the importance of science journalism, I think, isn't it? So, because on the one hand, you want the peer-reviewed journal, but on the other hand, the magazine brings it and makes it accessible.
Who pays for it?
Yeah.
Who pays for it?
Who pays for it? AIMS pay for it. We pay for it, the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences. Yep.
So, Flavia, why is there a need for an international council? Why do you need to bring people together? You would think that that would be a given.
Well, I think, it might be a given in theory, but in reality, obviously, we see that when we look across the landscape of science around the globe, that there are a few issues which are obviously the same. It's the funding systems, it's the incentives, it's the citation index, how do you make a career. But then on the other hand, there are also very specific questions which might differ from a region to another, and I would just be a little bit careful when we're talking about the trust in science. Where is this data coming from? Because I think we can see differences of communities and societies in their trust in science, and I think we have to make sure that we are not just using some North American white male data and just put it on all the regions of the world. Not that we're doing this, but I think it's just there are differences which we have to be very careful of. So I think the International Science Council is also championing science globally. I mean, we see with the 2030 agenda, we have now a framework for the communities, for the globe. We have global goals, they have to be translated down, and for the first time, science is really also mentioned as one of the motors, the engines to drive this sustainable development. So obviously it's very important that we have somewhere an aggregation of voices. It's like an assessment of assessment. We need a council who can somewhat credibly say that this is more or less sort of now what the overall global science community has to say, which doesn't mean that the International Science Council is doing the same job as the IPCC, for example, for climate change, looking at the climate science, or IPBES for biodiversity. But what the International Science Council does, it does, for example, review work or articles done by IPCC and IPBES. So sort of like it is, it's sort of like a cleaning house, a global global clearing house, excuse me, cleaning up, yes, a global clearing house when it comes to the science production. But I would like to come back on one or two or three points. I mean, me personally, my science champions were my parents, I must say, and I'm going to be grateful to them forever. And some of my teachers, others weren't at all, but teachers are. And this is why I would also like to advocate for the science ecosystem doesn't only depend on the scientists. I think they have obviously a primordial role to play in this, but it's really about an ecosystem where from an early age on, a girl is never discouraged to take the chemistry course just because she is a girl, or where parents really support the curiosity of their children. And I look, for example, this year is the International Year of, do you know that we have actually celebrating the International Year of the Periodic Table, the 150th anniversary of Mendeleev, which gave us actually the language and the grammar to talk about how this world actually looks like. And I mean, there are thousands of scientists engaging with schools, with science journalists, but again, I think it is this ecosystem where politicians have to create frameworks where science, but also science communication gets enough funding. You, as a scientist, you don't really get funding for science communication. As a scientist, you're not really getting funding for engaging with the community you would like to solve a problem for, and I think it was you mentioned, Terry, about the relevance. Transdisciplinary sciences doesn't get, there's not really a clear funding mechanism.
So there is no incentive.
There is no incentive. You're not being published because there is actually no really great peer-reviewed journal focusing on transdisciplinarity. You're not getting the Nobel Prize. You might not actually before that getting a professorship for it. So I think there is also a need, and I'm coming back now to the science community, and this is where the International Science Council is also active. We also have to transform the scientific enterprise itself. It's just too many white old male in buildings with walls which are just way too thick. These universities have to become much more transparent. And they have to actually, the interaction has to become much more easier. And I think here the science journalists play an important role, not only in talking and writing about the nice stories. Obviously, there are also a few critical stories around science. And I would also advocate for science journalists, obviously, to remain critical and truthful. Not everything is positive which comes out of scientific research. Many things are also very difficult and very critical. We don't know how to govern it, look at CRISPR or look at questions of artificial intelligence. So we need a very critical and very independent group of science journalists here who really make sure that we're not losing ourselves as scientists behind these thick walls.
Yeah, Natasha.
So I was really glad you talked about the role of education because, I mean, I've done a lot of these panels before and kind of speaking as a science journalist more broadly than just a journalist at The Economist, I do think that often science journalists, people look at us and they sort of say, gosh, you know, the public really doesn't understand science. They don't get science. We need, you know, we need journalists to engage, to inform the public, to kind of fill this deficit that's there. And, you know, to a certain extent, obviously, we do try and entertain, we try and inform, we try and engage. But there's only so much you can do if your basic science education function is not working in a country, or that, you know, primary school kids are just not getting proper science education, you know, and they're kind of disinterested and engaged by the time that the science education sort of formally kicks in. So there is this huge responsibility on governments, I think, to you know, promote science at a younger age. I really believe that very strongly, and I also think that, you know, as governments have expanded higher education and introduced charges, certainly in this country, one of the things they ought to have done really is to sort of tip the scales more in favour of supporting science degrees. They already do to a certain extent, but, you know, really, if you have if you charge the same amount to do a science degree as opposed to sort of something easier, right?
Yep.
You may find that you're going to have students doing more of the easier subjects. So I feel that that's kind of where a lot of the energy needs to be coming from. And then on top of that, we can talk about our institutions and our science champions. But I write about stories. I don't write a curriculum, right? Yep. And, you know, if you relied on a science journalist to supply a science education to a public, you're going to get a very distorted view of science, right? And we chase what's interesting and what's urgent. We don't write about what necessarily is important. I have a stack of really important subjects on that are just not getting written about because all the urgent stuff is there. Yep. So please don't rely on us, right?
No, I think that's a great point, which is, you know, one of the key themes of this panel is to say there is no one group of people, whether they are journalists, scientists, champions, advocates, whoever, that you can lay the sole responsibility you know, at their feet. It has to be the entire ecosystem that works, and it all needs to start with the basic education system that supports science, so people are scientifically literate to begin with, so you don't have to then, it's almost like an early stage pipeline versus there are people now, it's too late, and that's where we need to continue to do that. Mary, I'll come to you in 1 second. I just want to sort of lay the groundwork for our last theme that we want to discuss before we open it to the audience, and that will be about, are we really portraying, we meaning the collective big we, what science really, who really does the science, or who really should be doing the science? And do we have a role in making sure that we all work together to make sure the science as a discipline is more inclusive in all sense of the term, not only in terms of diversity of geography, gender, ethnicity, but also in terms of sectors and in terms of, including people into the science community, non-scientists. But before we get into that, Mary, you had a comment.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on the false expectation. I completely agree with Natasha, of science journalists being tasked with educating the public somehow about science. It's not the right role and not going to happen. One of the things that has held back science education in the US in recent years, and some would argue for a very long time, is the way it's organized, with individual school boards all over the country having the responsibility for their setting the curriculum in their community. So one way that scientists could play a role in public engagement that would be extremely effective is by being elected to or appointed to school boards around the country. There are very few scientists, I don't have the number, but it has been determined, very few scientists on school boards. That would change a lot, or at least has the potential to change a lot.
Yep, thank you. So Flavia, you talked about the white male in a lab coat behind a very thick, impenetrable wall, which is, suggests that discipline that has been, fraught with exclusiveness. So it's been an exclusive club, one would say, people would say. How do we make it accessible and inclusive to all, for everyone, everywhere, as we said in our title of this panel? Comments, thoughts in no particular order. Anybody who wants to take a go at it. Yep, so go ahead, Flavia.
Well, simply, I think we have to open the windows and the doors of these buildings, and we have to let people in, and as scientists, I think one has also to go out. I completely agree that this kind of interaction has to obviously increase, but again, I think it's again a shared responsibility. It's not just the scientist. I mean, really, I think we have to invest. This is not the cost, science communication as science journalists as well, because I mean, also media is under pressure when it comes to funding, and editors might be, do I actually now hire a scientific journalist or a political or an economic journalist? And so there is a decision to make. So I think the investment, the funding, the incentive is very crucial. But I would say yes, open these labs and let the people in and go out. Maybe just one point I would like to make is about relevance. I think science, and I deeply believe, actually should improve people's livelihood. And not just in one corner of the world, but also in all corners of the world. And I think there is one job scientists and politicians and the private sector have not done yet, is really a just and equitable distribution of the knowledge and the application of the knowledge. And I think this might also have to do, yes, that it's not inclusive enough and it's not relevant, and that communities are not participating in the research which is conceived and then conducted and then applied. So there we are in the co-production into citizen science. But I think a big equation here is really justice, and that benefits and risks of science are distributed in a just manner across the globe, and not just the benefits on one side and the risks on the other side. I mean, also looking at Africa, but also Asia and other areas of the world.
Thank you.
You know, the very reason behind the genesis of the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences responds to your question, Seema, that we decided about roughly 2 decades ago to enable young Africans to have access to high-end science education and cutting-edge research without necessarily dreaming of going to Harvard and Oxford, where most of them never land, not because they're not smart, but because of visa and immigration issues. So we launched AIMS in partnership with very top academic institutions, where our faculty come from more than 50 countries around the globe, including the universities that I mentioned earlier. So, number one, how do we increase the pipeline is to create and I like the term you use, Flavia. This is what we're saying today, that AIMS is deploying across Africa an ecosystem of science and innovation. Not just a learning institution, not just an academic institution. We want to enable the student who goes through AIMS to have access to science research while drawing on investment and funding and support R&D if they want to move into startup. The second way in which we think the second strategy on which we're working is to try to increase the representation of women in scientific fields. It's a deliberate strategy at the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences and Next Science and Forum that anytime we're recruiting new students, we have to reach the parity of 50-50. Right now, as I speak to you, 40% of our students, alumni, are women, and we're not satisfied with that. But when it comes to that, it's not just about access. It's also about retention. When you look at the way what the statistics are showing, not just in Africa, but globally in the STEM field, when women reach a certain level after their PhD in whatever fields you talk about in science, it drops compared to the number of men. Why? Because of a number of reasons which undermine women's career in STEM. So if we invest not just money, but we invest a lot in science education, in public engagement, raising awareness, providing conducive environment for women to do science across the globe and in Africa where I come from, I think we're going to reach the purpose you were outlining. And lastly, we cannot sit here in this room and say, okay, we can make it happen all by ourselves. I think Flavia mentioned this a number of times, the role of policymakers and government officials. You may hate them, you may not like them, but you have to engage them. Some of them you may say they're crooks, but you have to engage them. They have to understand what you're doing if you're top-notch scientists. If they don't, then whichever environment you're operating in, you might not be able to reach the results that we expect and we hope for.
Thank you.
I mean, I would just say, as a journalist, diversity of voices is really important, and especially writing about science. I hate writing those stories that are just, it's like all white men every single week, and it's exhausting, like cognitively exhausting. When there are brilliant women out there that I just don't know about, and I just, and so that's not to say that I don't like or love writing stories with my white men in that are about great science. I'm just saying that I kind of do sort of feel like I need to try harder all the time to find those female voices. And that kind of works at a number of levels. It can mean being a little bit more sort of forgiving with the women in sense of, maybe they're a bit more nervous about going on the record, so maybe we'll have a chat on background just to sort of start the conversation off, and then maybe we can talk about, well, I need you to sort of speak to a certain subject, can we talk on the record? So there's that, maybe being a bit more accommodating with the timings, like sometimes they can be harder to get hold of for obvious reasons. And at other times, I mean, a couple of times, we cut quotes a lot in The Economist. It's very hard to get an actual person quoted in The Economist. And a couple of times I've sort of said, look, can we please try and keep this woman in here? She's saying something interesting. I know we're tight on space, but she's interesting, she's relevant, and it would be loved. It's nice to have a female voice in this. So I think all those things are valid. I know that some science journalists have tried to kind of balance the number of female voices with the number of male voices. I've not found that to be particularly possible, shall we say. But I think I have to keep working harder. So I do try and get these voices in.
That's great, Mary, yes.
Yes, change is hard, and it takes leaders, and it takes pressure. in my experience, and sometimes policies. So leaders in things that maybe people have noticed that very recently, the director of the National Institutes of Health announced that he was no longer going to participate on manels, panel discussions that are only men. And that resulted in a whole lot of people saying, oh, I'm not going to either, and I haven't for a long time. But now it's kind of in the zeitgeist, and that's going to happen, even though it's been talked about for years and years and years and years with no change. You're changing the culture.
And
often
it won't happen overnight.
Yeah. It won't happen overnight, but if it can get a high-profile leader take a step out, that can make a big difference. And then there's pressure. So the example we often use is the example of how it happened, I'll use the NIH again, that the NIH changed their policy to include women in medical research studies. So I come from the terrible old era when a study that I was working on, funded at the time, the largest ever clinical trial funded by the NIH on preventing heart disease. But it was about preventing heart disease in men. And all of us who were working on that in the 70s and the 80s kind of, swallowed the Kool-Aid about everything we found out about heart disease, preventing heart disease in men would apply to women. I mean, people, including women, like me, were instructed on how to talk about that. Everybody believed it. It was in the literature. It wasn't that we were systematically trying to do something bad to women. We just had a completely crazy approach to it. I mean, it was crazy. So it took, and I was part of the group that worked on it, it took an act of Congress to change that. Something as simple and straightforward as men and women are different. Hello, It happened, and I think this is interesting too, it happened within the same 2-year period that legislation was enacted to stop having a smoking section on airplanes. Like that was even possible, that you could arbitrarily say in row 31 back is okay for smoking. It also happened at the same time that HIV/AIDS activists demanded that the FDA change its regulatory structure, and that the NIH significantly up its game in research, and Congress paid for that. So where did all that come from? It came from advocacy groups aligned in saying, we've had enough, we're going to make things change.
So the role of advocacy and even citizen advocacy or organized advocacy is important. I want to be sure, because we, I think, now have about 20 minutes left to see if the audience has questions, comments, want to make this interactive, this last piece. So I welcome you to come up. Yes, please come up. There's 2 microphones on either side of the rooms, right here up front. Please come on up. And if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself. Hello.
Hello, my name is Mary Cruz. I'm a freelance science writer from the UK. So my question is, I think we've seen a lot in recent years of awareness raising and trying to improve diversity in science, which is fantastic. But that alone is never going to be enough. So what we need is the underlying changes in the systems and structures that keep people out, things like parental leave policies, action on bullying and harassment. What sort of steps do you think that we can take that can practically support people and open up science a bit more to everyone?
Great question. Anybody want to start? I can also comment. Yes, please go ahead.
I'll just say a quick word. I think having the expectation, everyone in science, having the expectation that we will not settle for 40% when we want 50%, just continually keep asking and keep our collective sites at the high, you can call them high, but actually just at the level they should be. And that's everybody's jobs.
Yep, thank you. Anybody else? Thierry? So I'll comment, Thierry, while you're you're thinking about your answer. So you're absolutely right. I think it's not just a matter of having more people entering the pipeline, but it's also creating an environment in which you can that's inclusive and that encourages diversity, when somebody is in place. So the number of people leaving sometimes, you may pat yourself on the back because you got a number of women or number of diverse candidates coming into your pipeline and working for you. And then at the end of the year, you look and you say, well, I hired 3 people, but 5 people left. What's going on here? And until you have that sort of knowledge, you don't understand that there are things that keep people from actually staying. Some of them are very, very, very simple. Like you said, parental leave policy. For example, at Johnson & Johnson, we had both maternity and paternity leave policies so that it's about diversity and inclusion from both sides. So that a family of 2 can still take, time. Each other can help others. Sometimes it's just having a daycare on site and the ability to have a flexible work environment. In today's day and age, with the connectivity that we have, that shouldn't be difficult. Everybody is connected by internet, so the flexibility. So there are some of them are very simple things like that. Those are easy, low-hanging fruit that any institution should be able to leverage. But there's a bigger, broader issue of inclusion. So this is not about me personally, but if I were to walk into a room that is filled with people who don't look like me, then I may not feel like I belong. And after a while, I want to go somewhere where I feel like I have more people like me. So there is an aspect of representation. There is an aspect of inclusive environment that's important.
Were you at the conference in San Francisco a couple of years ago?
Yes. Yes.
So there's a biotech conference every year run by the investment house JP Morgan, and it's, mostly men. There's like a handful of women, and they had this one reception with all these scantily clad models, and it was extraordinary, and thankfully there was an outrage, right? But the fact that the people who sponsored this thought that this was in any way acceptable was quite extraordinary, I thought. And I wondered what you thought about that.
Oh, that was horrendous.
Were you there?
I didn't go there, thank God, because I would have been so outraged I'd have done something bad. But it was horrendous to think that, it was 2 years ago. 2 years ago, what was that, 2016?
Right.
In that day and age that you would think that that's how, people would behave, it's just horrendous. But, at least that was so visible and so outrageous, but there is a many sort of invisible and insidious other ways that women get treated, and that can be the reason why women leave, including not being included in sort of the after meeting after the actual meeting, and things like that.
I do think that once science fixes out its kind of structural problems, it will be easier to encourage girls to go into science. Because, when people who have girls ask me, oh, she's interested in science, do you recommend a career in science? I have a real problem. I'm really divided. On the one hand, it's a fascinating subject, but on the other hand, if they choose to be an academic, are they going to even be able to have a career, or are they going to bounce from postdoc to postdoc and then struggle to kind of balance the needs of a family? And so there are real structural issues here that are causing the problems all.
Absolutely. Thierry, yes.
Yes, there's something we're doing at our own level at the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences across Africa, which is bringing about some changes. It is slow, but policymakers are picking on that to try to change the way we approach inclusion and retaining women in science education environment across public institutions. At Ames, for instance, when you get pregnant, you don't get kicked out of your studies. You stay there. We render the facility appropriate for you to have your baby, to have a nanny or whatever
Yeah,
to
and
help you.
some context for people. At the African Institute of Mathematical Scientists, you stay there.
Yeah.
And so
You
you
live
actually
on
live
campus.
on campus
Yeah.
for 4 years. So that's why that's important.
Exactly. Which is something unthinkable in most universities, not just in Africa, even in the West. You see? So the second thing, what we're doing is to have practical, implementable, and effective policies. Policies that are not just draft for the organizational reviewers, but that people live by. And we educate young scientists, particularly male, in how you live and collaborate with peer female colleagues. Because sometimes we assume that all of us have great education when we were growing up. But that's not true. Some of us, we are carrying this problem from our home. When boys are watching a football match or soccer, and then girls are in the kitchen are washing the dishes, that's where we got it from. And sometimes it's mom who is perpetuating that and encouraged by dad who's not saying anything to correct it. When you get those grown-up kids into university, they can only replicate what they went through. So it takes us a lot of work to change their mindset, their habit, and to be able to, for them to see that they are in that environment to collaborate on an equal basis. But let us not shy away from what it takes to do that. It takes not just policy. It takes goodwill, consistency, but it also takes money, investment. So if you have to, instead of a room for one student, you have to invest to have a room that can accommodate a baby and a houseworker, a housekeeper. You need to invest in that. So this is something that we're seeing is bringing some changes in the academic institutions in Africa, because we're telling ministers of education, science, and technology, you have bright women scientists, but they can't stay because of A, B, C in public institutions. Oh, is that so? Then we're going to do something about it. So we're raising awareness with public officials.
That's great. Yeah. I see that we have 2 questions over here and 1 question over here. So we want to make sure we get to the audience questions. Please go ahead.
Hi, my name's Stephanie Hills. I work with the press office at CERN. It was more of an observation of something practical that everybody in this room could do. You've talked a lot about policy and changing of policy that would help. But as a press officer, I'm sure there are quite a few in this room, whether you're in publicly funded science or commercial, you should be focusing on putting up interviewees who represent either the community that funds you or your client base, your customer base. So think about diversity and inclusion in your interviewees. And if you're a journalist speaking to a press officer, be specific and say that you'd really like a diverse people as your interviewees. It might mean that you're talking to people slightly more junior. You tend to find that the diversity at the moment, as you go up the pyramid, you find less women, less diversity. But if you're willing to speak to the postdocs who've been part of the actual research team, you will get more diversity. This is something really, really simple. This doesn't need governments to change policy. This is just about people in this room thinking a little more carefully about who they put up for interviewees or who they want to interview.
One of the things I would just say is that the older, more experienced journalists, male or female, tend to be much easier and to interview, and you get better quotes out of them, and they're more willing to generalize. Whereas I find the postdocs and the sort of young researchers, they're very nervous about
Extrapolation.
Right, extrapolation, about speaking for other people, about going outside their own specific area of expertise and saying what is generally known in the field. And so that is a real challenge with junior researchers. But like I say, I'm willing to kind of help with that. If somebody fronts a good junior researcher for me, I'm willing to work with them to try and get something good out of them, because I do think it's really important.
And perhaps it's an expectation that scientists must do this, and that it's not shy away from that, during when they're educated and when they're going through their career progress.
Right, they've got to learn, right, absolutely.
All right, one more question here and then a question over here. Yes.
Hi, so my name is Lingwen Huang. I work right across the street at EPFL. And I run also a YouTube channel. I'm really on social media more generally. It seems to me that these social medias these days are conveying a lot of the information and are really changing how people view the world. And they are really biased by the recommendation systems that are used by the different social medias. So for instance, I have a YouTube channel where it's about mathematics, and 7% of my views are female, 7% only, and it's not specific to my channel. A lot of YouTube channels in science have an overwhelming majority of male viewers. Do you think that something should be done about this? Like, do you think the recommendation systems have now an important responsibility to promote science in general and diversity in science? Thank you.
That's a really tough question. I think we're at the beginning of a very long discussion about how channels like YouTube need to be presented and filtered. I think it's very difficult to argue that YouTube needs to sort of fix a deficit in the sense that you know, they need to present certain bits of information. I will say that. I'd need to know more about whether there really is some kind of algorithmic bias before I'd be willing to sort of put my neck out on the line and say, yes, we need to fix it. So I think I'm pleading ignorance really on this one, but let's have a conversation about it afterwards if you think that there's a problem, because it's an interesting question. But there's lots of things wrong with YouTube in terms of, you know, just how you can jump from one thing to the next, and you're getting very, very poor quality information that may have like high numbers of likes, and you know, it's spreading a lot of misinformation, and I think that's something that we need to have a conversation about, but perhaps not here.
Yeah, and even in the broader context of social media, you know, and how science and science journalism and science communications fits into that, and the role, and is there something that we can leverage out of those?
Yeah, you have to be on social media.
Yeah.
Like all your organizations, you have to be doing social media. And if you're not, then you're not part of the conversation, and somebody else is having a conversation about you and your organization.
But I think it's, I guess this is also where I mean, we all know, yes, we have to be on social media, but there is very little, but there is conversation obviously on how we have to be on social media, and what are actually the criteria, and what is the capacity of people, where do you learn to judge one source of information against another one. I think actually social media, the digital revolution, I mean, just to say, I mean, the big topic has a huge potential, very positive potential, but obviously can also be abused. If politicians are now actually discussing the most important, most threatening issues only by Twitter, more or less, if invitations, if I'm getting out of this agreement is only sort of like transmitted by Twitter, where you have obviously to be short, this is, I mean, this is also scary. And I think as a community, and again, not just as a science community, also as a media community, which is threatened by social media as well. I mean, the traditional print media, obviously books, we have an issue with that. So I would also actually argue, and I think this is where I also very much appreciate, Seema, your champion idea that the champions for science are not only scientists. Again, this is a conversation beyond borders of professional or disciplines or whatever. I mean, this is really a societal necessity that we talk to each other across countries, across also regions, geographic regions. How do we use this? How do we regulate? If we have a Mark Zuckerberg going to the US Congress and saying, well, we're actually just an IT company and of course we can regulate ourselves. And I mean, we're all feeding that machine. Something is deeply wrong, in my opinion. I mean, you cannot say that something which influences our life so tremendously can be regulated by the ones who are producing it. Hey, where is here the peer review, the larger peer review to say what has to happen? Now, but again, I think this is a responsibility, and International Science Council is obviously also investing in that question of ICTs. How do we create a dialogue where everybody, to be truly inclusive, has a voice at this table? And we seem to struggle, and time is actually becoming extremely short. We don't have that much time. We don't have another 2 generations to solve all these issues. How do we govern all these big issues? The UN is struggling with it. The European Union is struggling with it. The science community, the media, everybody. The private sector still seems to make huge amounts of money, but investing it in other things. So how do we create this platform where we can somewhat come to conclusions which really allow a sustainable and inclusive development?
So thank you, Flavia. That's great. And I'm going to just say 2 things. Thierry, I know you've been wanting to say something, and I know we have to make sure we get your question in. And speaking of time is running short, I'm also watching the clock. So first, Thierry, if the comment is on the previous question, please go ahead. And then we want to make sure we get to your question.
Just a couple of 2 things, saying that your question is valid, and I may not provide a straightforward answer because it got me into thinking more about it. But I will make a couple of comments. Number 1, it's a YouTube channel about mathematics. Let's keep that in mind. Not all other science, it's mathematics. And I don't know how many times all of us in this room have engaged into informal or formal discussion with a friend, with family members, with anybody. When you say mathematics, people dread that discipline. It has nothing to do with just female. So this may have to do with the YouTube channel, the way viewers see it. But the second thing is how many people are out there, both male and female, interested in mathematics. This is a discussion, a thinking that you may think about and how to attract more viewers, and particularly females. What we have encountered in the AIMS context is that sometimes many female will say, oh, I'm not interested in mathematics, because science, particularly mathematical sciences, are viewed as a male-dominated discipline. So we have to change that. This is how one of the problems we encountered at AIMS, it may look similar to the lack or the weak number of viewers that you're getting on YouTube. At AIMS, when we started, we recruit students after a bachelor's degree and train them at master's degree level. But what we realized was that we were not getting enough applications from female students. So we went back to study the cause of that. Of course, there were not many women out there in the math and science department graduating in bachelor's degree. They will drop, not because they're not smart. So what we realized we should do in the AIMS ecosystem, which was not our core program at the very beginning, we said, let's go into math and science teacher training program. We opened that. We want to encourage young people from primary school, and particularly female, to get involved, to get interested in science. And we want to revolutionize, which we've started doing 10 years ago, revolutionize the way mathematics is taught at school. Because the way mathematics is taught at school has alienated not only many generations in Africa, but particularly women. When the school teacher comes into class and asks, Flavia, go to the board, solve this problem. Flavia fails. The other female fails, and calls in a third, a boy, and who solved the problem? Because he's got more time to think. Flavia will drop at some point. You see? So we try to change the pedagogy. And Flavius, I'm sorry, it's just we changed that pedagogy, and we're injecting, reviewing the curriculum of teaching mathematics at secondary school level and engaging more children, more females at primary school level. So you might want to think about the strategy of getting even females who are not interested in mathematics viewing your YouTube channel.
Great, bravo. Okay, introduce yourself and your question, please. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, my name is Bernard Apia, and I happen to come from Ghana. I happen to be a science journalist, but I'm also a scientist, so I'm more in academia as well. I really like the session, and I think that it's always great to engage, different people in regards to science. However, one thing that I have realized is that it appears that when we discuss diversity, there appears to be some groups that we are also not doing a lot to reach them. And just last week, in Ghana, we were organizing a program to engage people who are deaf, to design something like a docudrama, okay, to engage them on health research. And we had those people who were deaf and those who could also hear, both actors and researchers together to find out about the best way to design this docudrama to engage deaf people and then their families. And for me, even though I do a lot of engagement research, it was the first time I had that group. And the kind of knowledge they had, I was so amazed. So I'm just asking, to what extent are we involving people who may have disabilities, particularly the deaf? Because according to the WHO, about 5% of the global population have some hearing loss. And if we are promoting diversity, I think that group and some others may also have to be brought on board. So I just want to know to what extent we are involving them.
Yeah, I think, when we talk about diversity, at least, much of the definition, I know sometimes the focus automatically goes towards women and towards ethnicities, but I think disabilities, clearly an important, but also, LGBTQ, diversity in terms of generation, in terms of ageism, all of that I think is included and involved. And I think there too, policies in terms of the Disabilities Act and other things have helped pave the way. But for us to be able to kind of communicate that and shed a light on that, I think is an important part. And what I'm going to do is, because we are supposed to be leaving soon, right? Now, you want us to leave now, because just a piece of explanation. When we leave here now, all these tables are going to get dismantled. And this room is going to become an auditorium again. Underneath, the flat surfaces are all going to come up. They're going to become seats. So the team here needs to do that transformation in 15 minutes for the next session to continue. So we're going to, do we have time for 2 minutes. So first of all, I want to thank the audience for your engagement. I hope you found this discussion useful, and I hope you were tweeting throughout so that the conversation cannot end here, because it needs to continue. And we'll continue this not only here, but throughout in multiple other congresses. Second, I want to thank all of the panelists for a really interesting and broad-based discussion. We got to the tip of the iceberg, I think, on multiple issues. It's always hard despite the time. And again, I want to keep you all engaged in this conversation moving forward. So to end, I would ask each of you to maybe use one word, or maybe 2 at the most, to say, what can we do to champion science? Who wants to go first? Natasha.
One word.
One word. You're a journalist.
I'm genuinely stumped. Excitement.
Excitement. Excellent. Mary?
Engage.
Okay.
ecosystem.
Champions. Thank you, Seema, for bringing us all together.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you for being champions of science. Appreciate your engagement.